Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for my talk, What Git Metrics Can Tell You About Your Team, here at Data Platform Virtual Summit 2022. I'm very excited to be here as part of this event and bring you my knowledge about this particular subject. So I'm Dwayne. I live in Chicago. I am a developer advocate, have been since about 2016. I have helped a lot of people figure out a lot of stuff, including Git, command line tools, DevOps, security, lots of stuff. I'm always happy to talk about tech with people. Hit me up on Twitter. It's the best way to get a hold of me in all reality. DMs are always open. And besides tech, if you ever want to talk about things like improv or rock and roll or karaoke, I would love to chat with you. Also, like knitting and crochet. Probably should add that into the slide, but there's a lot going on already. I work for a company called Git Guardian. Git Guardian is a code security platform for DevOps. Anywhere your code goes, it carries with it the risk of exposing secrets or vulnerabilities. Git Guardian is an awesome way to make sure that those vulnerabilities and secrets stay secret and secure. That's about all I'm going to say about it. Go to gitguardian.com to read up more about it and get more information. I'm not here to talk about that today. What I am here to talk about is a very, very deep subject, and I can't possibly cover every aspect today. I can't even cover in depth one particular facet of it, which I'll talk about later. What I can do is give you a bunch of ideas, a bunch of questions that you can go out and research on your own. And that's really my goal today, is to give you enough knowledge to go out and start exploring this stuff. So why this session then? Why am I talking about this particular area? Again, a very large area. Well, let's start from the ground up. We all know that measuring things is very important. As Lord Kelvin here, the guy that invented the Kelvin scale, says, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. We all fundamentally know this is true. That's the whole point of metrics, is to tell us how we're doing. Measuring some things is very easy and very important. A server's uptime is very important. Disk capacity, super important for a system. And these are things we can capture and put together in things like dashboards like New Relic makes. I love New Relic, by the way. Don't work for them, but I do love their tools. These are really important data points, and together they paint this picture of the health of a server. And this is a good thing because it's easy to measure as well as important information. We can also measure things that are easy, but maybe aren't the most relevant bits of data. For instance, how many bagels did each developer eat in the break room might be important for ordering bagels, but is it important for your DevOps practice or the overall mission of your organization? Not really, unless they're eating a lot of bagels. Maybe they are. But these are things that are very easy to measure overall, but they don't really tell us anything. They don't paint a bigger picture that helps us improve. Which leads us to the conversation of DevOps. Measuring the right thing in DevOps is way harder than we give it credit for. Because what do we measure? Lines of code deployed? Well, that can't be right, because if we could solve something more elegantly in 5 lines than 500 lines, we should probably do that. So it can't be the number of lines deployed. Config simplification? Well, a very simple config can be overwhelmingly confusing to someone that's not used to reading very elegant code. Number of support requests after an update? Maybe that does tell us something. Maybe that tells us that something along the line is broken. And it tells us part of the story. Time to go from testing to prod? Okay, now we're getting closer. But there's so many choices to make. There's so many ways to look at these complex systems. And the problem is not that we don't have enough data. We've never had this much data in the history of the world. There are 44 zettabytes approximately at the beginning of this year stored on servers everywhere. Some of that is production data. Some of that is DevOps data. Some of that is commit data. By the year 2025, there'll be 175 billion terabytes of data we have access to as a world collectively. We're creating so much more every day. It's also really hard to judge what is valuable out of data sets that large. I know there are other talks here about building data lakes, and data lakes terrify me in concept because just like real life lakes, they're dirty and we don't know what's at the bottom. And they don't really tell us anything other than there's a giant body of something here. And that's what BI and analysis is all built around, like figuring out what's in there, figuring out how we can take all these bits of data, pull them, and then pull out what we need. Luckily, we're not alone in this fight. If everyone's doing this completely independently, sure, I think we might have a lot of different kinds of conversations, but we can kind of focus all the DevOps work that's going on in the world through the lens of Google. Google, love them or hate them, has a lot of money to throw around at research. And they threw a bunch of money behind the research that went into Dora, DevOps Research and Assessment Project. Dora paid for this book to be made. Accelerate, Building and Scaling High-Performing Technology Organizations. If you have not read this book yet, if you were watching this as a video, I would say pause the video and then go and read this book and then come back and keep watching the video. If you're watching this live, well, just write it down if you haven't read this book yet. If you've read this book, the next few slides are going to sound pretty familiar to you, but that's good because hopefully the most of this talk will be a new way to think about what's in this book. But here's a gross oversimplification. Again, I'm condensing a whole book into about 3 slides. So Dora metrics basically say you can look at organizations that do DevOps right, elite performers, and you can see that they are clearly doing something right because their business and mission benefits are very visible and they have happy customers and employees. If you do DevOps poorly, you're going to struggle and you're going to have a high employee burnout. That's one of the main ways we can tell if an organization is doing good or bad. You can boil down a DevOps practice to these 4 leading indicators. Again, gross oversimplification of what's in the book. Go read the book. There's a whole book about this, about the science, the math, all of that. Before we jump to any conclusions about those metrics, let's just remember really quickly, that's the jump to conclusions mat from Office Space over there on the right. But more importantly, chasing metrics on their own for the sake of, oh, I can be an elite performer if I just get these metrics up. What they called on the wire, juking the stats. That doesn't get you anything. That doesn't solve the crime in Baltimore on the wire. It doesn't solve the underlying issues you have as an organization to go, hey, we just have to increase the number of deployments per day. That's going to lead to a lot of problems, mainly instability in a system that's not doing it correctly. Having said that, go read the book, but here's what those 4 Dora metrics are all about. The first one is deployment frequency. How often do you get code out to production? That's simple. How often do you release features that will delight your end user and your customer? Lead performers do this all the time. Every day, multiple times a day, multiple times an hour. They do it on Friday afternoons. They do it on Sunday nights because a human being isn't involved in doing that very last mile push. You can push something on Friday, and by the time all the tests complete, and by the time it goes through the entire QA system, by the time it hits code production, it could be Sunday night. Elite performers don't worry about things like that. They've automated so much that they can push code nearly constantly and simply get the results they want. Mean lead time for changes. How long does it take a commit to go from being pushed from a local machine all the way to production? This is essentially the health metric for your team's DevOps cycle. If you look at it from a certain perspective, if you want to go so fast, how fast does each individual change take determines how fast you can go. Also, it determines your capacity. If you can only go so fast with a current load, what does 2xing that load do? Does it have your time? Or does it, more realistically, square root your time, where you have an order of magnitude slower than you were before? I don't know the answer to that. Only you can know that. But we know that elite performers have very, very short lead times to changes. When a request is made, the time it hits production is a shorter window than for underperforming people. Mean time to recover. Things are going to go wrong. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. Things go wrong in the process. What you do when things go wrong is ultimately what matters. How long does it take your team to restore service? Not start working on the fix, not pick up the ticket, not process the report or whatever you want to call it. How fast does the fix get pushed to production? Ultimately, this is the measure of stability across a DevOps system. If a catastrophic failure can be immediately restored with a single couple of keystrokes and you roll back, that's a pretty healthy system. If it is 2 days to recover from a bad code push, you're not in good shape. Monitoring is a huge piece of this. As soon as you know any part of your system is something goes wrong and you can get back as quick as possible with the help of that monitoring and tool, then you are going to be leaning more toward that elite side of things. Change failure rate, the last big of the four Dora 4 metrics. How often does making changes lead to those failures in production? Now, this is different than the mean time to recover. This is how often are you breaking things, which does definitely impact and make number 3 a metric we care about, but number 4 stands alone on its own. If you're pushing a lot of code every day just to chase that metric of frequent code deployments, but you're breaking things left and right, and it causes much more of your developer time to be spent on non-mission critical code making and new features that will delight your audience, as it says in the Accelerate book, then you really are leaning toward that poor performer side, not the elites. If you're spending all of your coding time, every single minute that someone codes, pushing toward delighting your audience, then you're doing it right. There's no one true root cause to any kind of issue around change failure. Failures happen. They just do. You want them to happen very infrequently. Automation of testing is going to help you out with this a lot. Catching a failure in your local environment is the cheapest way to do it. Catching it in a test environment is pretty safe to do. Catching it in production, that's where the catastrophic failure comes in, and that's where the real problem arises. The Dora team has put together this nice matrix for you. I'll take a second you can screenshot this. You can find this in 1,000 places online, including the Dora book and including the reports that Google keeps putting out. But here it is in a clean matrix. If you're elite, high, medium, or low, I can't tell you that. You can, after some research into it and really taking a serious look at your organization. And that is really where I want to make the transition to what I really came here to talk to you about Git Metrics. Because I know you're thinking right now, it's like, was this just a rehash of Accelerate? No. I've done a lot of thinking about this in the last year of my life, ever since I first read the Accelerate book. And I spend my time working in Git. I used to work for a company called Git Kraken, and now I work for a company called Git Guardian. Git is in my blood. I love the concept of version control. So what can Git tell us about our DevOps practices? How can we map Git metrics to Dora metrics? That's what the next part of this talk is all about. And hopefully, if you haven't stopped watching because you already read the Accelerate book, you'll get something out of this. I think it's important to make some definitions here up front. What Git metrics can tell you about your team. Well, what is Git? Git is a version control system. Git allows us to take snapshots of our work at various points in time. Unlike previous version control systems and other alternative methods, we're taking complete snapshots of the directory where our Git folder is and all the recursive subdirectories thereunder. So if we make a change on version 1 or version 2 of file A1, we make a completely new compressed version of A1. And if B doesn't change, it just points back to the previous version. We chain all of these commits together. That's what we call those snapshots, commits. We chain those commits together, and that gives us our branches and our Git history. This is such a stable, safe, reliable, efficient way to do things that it has become the linchpin of the entire DevOps world. This wasn't the original intent of Git. Git was built to handle Linus Torvalds' need for managing patches when building Linux. But it became this overarching tool that everybody uses in this entire ecosystem. Martin Fowler, when he wrote his first book on continuous integration, did not write it about Git. It came out in 2006, I believe, and Git was still in its infancy then, not really known outside of the Linux world. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about what Git is because I think we all know it. This is more a slide for people that might not be familiar with why Git is so critical to this story of DevOps. Because it underpins so much, it can tell us an awful lot about what's going on in our DevOps operations. What are Git metrics in this scenario? This is where we're going to start mapping things. So if it's in blue, it is a Dora metric, and if it's in red, it is a Git metric, just for the sake of clarity for the next few slides. The first Git metric I want to talk about is cycle time. This refers to how much time a team spends from the start of their work until it gets deployed. This is the time they pick up that Jira ticket, they sign off on Asana, they go look at an issue in the issue queue and say, yes, I'm going to work on that. And they sign up for it. To the time that code makes it into production and an end user actually experiences the benefit of it. What does that cycle look like? This feeds into our mean lead time for changes. MLTC, in other words, is a subcomponent of your overall cycle time. Cycle times are going to vary greatly depending on what you're doing. If you're delivering a giant feature, that's of course going to be a longer cycle time than if you deliver just a bug fix. The mean lead time for changes is an overall better metric for the health of your organization and not your project. Cycle time, though, can tell you a lot about how your company approaches projects. Shorter cycle times mean you're taking things in smaller bite-sized chunks. And that's going to point toward better mean lead time for changes and put you more on the path to our elite. Coding time. This also is a subset of cycle time. This is how long it takes you to pick up that ticket to you pushed code from your local. What does that look like? Why this is important is the shorter this gets, the more it points to a well-defined request. If the ticket is unclear, you're going to have to go clarify it first. If the ticket's unclear and it doesn't seem important, you're going to have to go justify why this ticket is on your desk. If it's not that important, it's going to get deprioritized and it's going to stay in your queue until you kick it out of your queue. And some people can't kick things out of their queue. It's very important to understand how much time is spent per ticket and the average time that people spend per ticket that points to, well, how long does it take to actually get those changes to production? A really good communication system will always point toward a smaller chunk of coding time per feature. Pull requests, time until review. Pull requests are how we do work in Git. You make your changes and then you suggest them in so they can be approved and then deployed. This is the amount of time it takes to go from, hey, I'm ready for my PR to be reviewed, until the QA or testing team can actually get to it. That might sound trivial. It might sound like, okay, you're going to have a lot of ways to prioritize that. Overall, though, that's a huge indicator of your deployment frequency. If your QA team is buried and just constantly working on the same request every single time a request is made, they can only do so much. You can kind of think of it like an hourglass here. The bottleneck, the pinch there to your deployments is that QA testing. It's very important it's there, but we want that to be as wide as possible and let as many sand grains fall through there as possible. Well, not fall through there, pass through there as possible. There's no real one clear fix to get to a better, a shorter queue of PRs, but automation is really going to be key here. Shifting left here, as I say at the bottom, of testing. Test-driven development is a thing for a reason, is because it works and it leads to really good results. The earlier you're testing something, the cheaper it is to fix it. If it fails on my local, I shouldn't ever push it. If it fails in my dev environment, I shouldn't push it. If it fails in testing, we definitely shouldn't push it. And if it fails in prod, then the whole system broke down. How long does it take to do PRs? Not all PRs are created equal. Fully transparent on that. Small 3-line fixes for a bug are definitely faster to review. But overall, it's going to point to how effective your communication strategy and testing automation really are in your setup. Again, if good automation exists, then you really shouldn't spend that much time in the PR review cycle. That's what robots are for. They can do 1,000 tests in the time it takes you to go get a cup of coffee. And when you come back, in a perfect world, in a perfect utopian worldview, a QA person, quality assurance or testing person would simply look at a dashboard, see all the lights are green, go actually look at the lines of code that was suggested, see if it's commented correctly, see if it matches their linting standards and whatnot. Maybe do a manual test just for the heck of it. See like, okay, human being actually did a test. 5 minutes tops. Moving on to your next ticket. Kick that PR into the automation system so it can build and deploy and you're done with it. If your PR review time is very short and you have a very low failure rate overall, you're doing great. If it is very, very long and you have a very small failure rate, well, is that acceptable? Because ultimately, this isn't about change failure rate. This is about your mean lead time for changes. How fast QA can do things is a blocker for how fast you can actually deploy new things that will delight your end user. And that's ultimately the goal of the business. Rate of code rejections from PRs. This is another easy metric to track, I believe, depending on how your QA system is set up and your PR systems are set up. But you can just go look at your comments. And if there are no comments on a PR other than approved, smiley face, thumbs up, then you're doing it right. If there are 30 back and forth, the real problem here is that you're spending all of that time of QA and the coder on those problems and not delivering new business benefits. This isn't really tied to change failure rate, even though code rejection is failure along the way, because change failure rate is only really concerned about production failures. Rejection for failures in the QA process don't really affect that number, ideally. Again, this is really related to deployment frequency when it really comes down to it, how fast you can get that code out the door. Branch lifetimes, project branch lifetimes. I want to say a caveat up front, it's at the bottom, but I really want to start with it. Local branches are awesome. They don't factor into this equation. If you have 1,000 branches in your local and you're managing them locally and it works for you, keep doing that, because always working in a local branch is a good idea. There's never a bad time to work in a local branch. If you push that branch up toward your version control system, your central repositories, your GitHubs, your GitLabs, whatnot, and they live there forever and they never get merged, that's going to be problematic. Now, every company's different on how they approach workflows, or Git flow versus GitLab flow versus trunk-based development versus I don't know. Everyone's going to approach it slightly different. What Dora tells us is that elite performers mostly tend toward trunk-based development, where people have very short-lived feature branches or maybe none at all on their actual shared version control servers. People are committing to that main deployable code base almost directly, as fast as they can. Open source projects are an exception to this. There are a few caveats they put in the book, but open source is one of the big ones. Because of the nature of open source, where there's not a business unit driving, it's a community organically making a thing because it needs made and because it makes the world better in our collective commons, they can get awesome results from long-lived feature branches. Look at projects like Drupal is a really good example of that, in my opinion. Well, I'm very familiar with Drupal. That's why I say that. But other than open source and maybe some governmental things, you want your branches on your shared servers to be very short-lived. Only long enough to meet the requirements that were scoped for that particular feature you're working on, bug fix you're working on, or whatever that work is, and then deleted as soon as they're not needed. Again, locally, you can manage your systems however you want, and that's not going to factor in here. Always use branches if developing locally. If you have nothing else to take away from this talk, always work in branches locally. Number of commits. I almost started with this one, but it's the most obvious one, and I wanted to end with it because there's a lot to it. Because the way Git works, this is the fundamental unit of work for Git, for our work. We can always look at our Git history. Git log will show us every single commit made. You can base so much off of this information. It's unrealistic to think that a dev will ever get it right in one particular go, and there's one commit per feature, unless they're squashing everything at the very end of their work, so they hide all of their other work. Then we can expect that a developer is going to spend a few iterations to get it right. And sure, in the final history, they might rewrite history and rebase, and it might show up differently. But the point is, if you have a lot of changes needed for every single feature that you deploy versus a handful, that tells you something about your organization. Are you scoping the work in bite-sized, reasonable chunks to get you to that MVP, that minimum valuable product? Or viable, but valuable is more important, or I think better word to use there. What shows value? What can we derive some kind of feedback from our users from? Minimum viable product, minimum valuable product. Very similar ideas though. But anyway, how long is that commit chain? Is it very long? Is it very short? Some features are going to take a lot of commits. Some features aren't. But we can always use the average of that in other equations when we start building out KPIs. Part of the beauty of this is those Dora 4 metrics are the leading indicators, not the only indicators, not the only metrics you're going to care about. In fact, they're made up and comprised of some of these metrics, as we've already shown. But there's just a couple ideas at the bottom. Average commits per release, average commits per day, per feature, mean commits per branch. They just paint a picture of what the team is doing. Taking those pictures and then arranging them to tell the story, that's what Dora really is all about, is looking at your metrics in a way that paints a good story. You might have noticed something about all what I just talked about with Git Metrics. They all mapped to those first two. I think that's intentional. Mean time to recover. Well, to understand recovery, you must understand what failure means. From a code perspective, the code ran or it didn't. You can automate all of that. But when the code ran, did it produce the results you were expecting? Did it delight the customer? Did it frustrate the customer? What does failure mean? Those are things Git really can't tell us. Git is the stupid content tracker. I'm not making that up. If you type man git into a terminal, that's the very first thing the manual tells you is git -- the stupid content tracker. It doesn't add security, doesn't take security away. It doesn't add to your DevOps practices. It doesn't take away. It's just a tool. Same thing with change failure rate. Git doesn't know what failure means. It just knows how many commits you made. It knows what branch names are, and it knows where head is pointing at any given time. But it can't tell you these business terms of failure and mean time to recover. Those are DevOps terms. Those are bigger than Git. Git's part of the story with there as well, but I don't think Git metrics particularly map to those last two well. However, having said that, there are companies out there that are working to tell the holistic picture, with Git metrics being core to the story. Companies like Haystack and GitLab are people I relied on, and Linear B are companies that I relied on when writing this talk. I used to work for that company, GitKraken, and they make a tool that is integrated to tell you all about your Git metrics. It should be out by the time you see this talk. Go check their website. But GitLab, if I had to point to one company on this whole board and say, hey, that's where the one company where I learned the most by watching their YouTube videos and by reading their documentation, I'll link to them later in the talk when I talk about resources. But these are companies that are building a New Relic style dashboard for DevOps. Taking the ideas of Accelerate and saying, all right, let's boil it down to a dashboard that everyone can agree this is the health of our company. This is the health of our DevOps practice. I can't tell you what's right for you. I can't tell you which one of these is going to fit your company best. What I can say is it's probably worth your time to investigate each and every one of these if you care about improving your DevOps organization. And that's the next piece. Is what do I mean by your team, by your organization? We know what Git is. We know what Git Metrics are now. We understand that DevOps picture that it all points to with Dora. But what about your team? What do we mean by your team? There's multiple ways to look at this. There is you and your immediate coding team, the team you were either leading. If you're watching this talk, there's a good chance that you are leading the team or you're a senior member. Or maybe you're just getting started and you're just trying to figure this stuff out to be like, how do I fit into my team? These are easy questions to ask. They're not easy questions to answer. Is everyone using Git the exact same way? Is everyone bought into the same workflow methodology? Is everyone squishing commits? Does that affect your commit count? These are things to explore and ask. And again, easy conversations to start, maybe not the easiest conversations to get to a clear, concise answer on. That last one, though, I think is a really good question that I don't know how to even go about that conversation in most organizations. But onboarding a new person, does that affect those 4 Dora metrics? If the answer is no, your mean time to production, your deployment fail rate, and all of those things, if those aren't impacted at all, then you're probably doing onboarding right. If all of a sudden you are 20% slower on code deployments because you brought on a new member, something's not right there. I can't tell you what's right for you, but if we're doing all of this correctly, if there's no tribal knowledge in someone's head that you have to get on the phone with them to make sure the new person can do their job, then you're probably leaning toward more the elite side. There's your DevOps team and you. DevOps is a very, very broad area, and theoretically, everyone in your entire company is on your DevOps team. In reality, though, there are a specific set of people that care about those systems, that care about those tools, that care about how they're all integrated. And I consider that your DevOps team. I'm going to say right now, I think QA is part of this, but I also have them on the next slide as well. Do you have a clear understanding of who's responsible for what across that org? Who owns each individual piece? Who owns the overall delivery of the integrations? Who owns the overall deployment pipeline? Is it one person? Is it a committee? Just knowing that is a very important step. I think there's some organizations where that's not a clear picture, and that's a hindrance every time it comes up. The Dora book, the Accelerate book, specifically recommends that you get somebody that is an agile lead. That is a secret to success. Get a scrum master. Get an agile expert. If you don't have one, maybe it's time to step up and be that person. If this interests you, if this is something you care about deeply, that probably points to you should probably go get a scrum certification. Couldn't hurt. Is everyone using the same tools? It's communication tools. Is everyone comfortable using them in the same way? I love Loom. I'm making this particular recording on Loom because I think it's such a great tool. You can see my expression, how exasperated I am if I hit a bug, or how happy I am if I'm celebrating a success. Meanwhile, I can easily share my screen. I wish everyone on my team, no matter where I ever worked, would use Loom on the regular, because it's a more human way to interact, I think, than just a message in Slack. How much of everything is automated? If human beings are required for every step in your process, you do not have DevOps. You are doing waterfall really fast manually. If everything is automated and I can do a pull request, and from that moment on, it takes one other person to say, I approve as the QA person, and then it hits production, you're probably doing it right. Your QA and support teams. There's typically not one team that does both. If you're a very small organization, probably because everybody wears all hats in small orgs. But your QA team and your support team are very directly related, because at the end of the day, a bug is a bug is a bug is a bug. Doesn't matter who discovered it. Doesn't matter where it came from. If the code doesn't do X when it's expected it'll do X when you smash the button, someone's got to deal with that. If that's discovered internally, we typically put that on the shoulders of QA to do that feedback cycle with developers and fix it and then get it back out. Support teams are dealing with the outside world. How are they talking to each other? Are they talking to each other? In elite organizations, I guarantee they are. I guarantee they're using the same basic mechanisms to deal with bugs in the feedback loop and getting those new tickets made so developers can fix it. How much feedback for your team comes from the support team versus QA? If there's a wall there and you only hear about support requests from the support team when they hit Jira or Asana or whatever project management tool you use, there's a problem there. You need to know what they're facing because they are your face to the customer. Even if you don't want to talk to customers directly, I get that. Not every developer wants to be a developer advocate or a support person. Totally get that. But you should have some kind of insight into what they're battling. Empathy is key to good communication. Without that personal, I know the face of my support person, you'll never have that empathy. Your marketing and sales teams are part of your organization and they are a driving critical part of your organization. I'm an old sales guy. I did sales for the first 12-ish years of my career. There's a saying that I love: sales and marketing pull fire from the sky, because they're out there every day hammering the phones and figuring out new ways to get in front of people and new approaches that will bring more people to your website. They're doing really hard work and we can't just write them off. Do they even use version control? No, of course not. They're not going to contribute your Git metrics that way. But how much of your roadmap is driven by them? If all of it, that's a problem. If it's none of it, that's a serious problem. What systems of truth are they looking at? Do you have access to those systems? Are you logging into Salesforce? Probably not. Have you ever seen a Salesforce report about customer satisfaction rate and churn? If you haven't, call your head of sales and say, hey, I'm so-and-so from dev team. I'm just curious what our churn rate looks like. They'll be delighted to talk to anybody about that because they want that problem fixed immediately. And how do you fix churn? You delight your customers. You make sure your customers are having a wonderful experience. That feedback loop is vital and important. So communicating with them, are they communicating the same way with them as you are with QA, with your DevOps team, with your team? I don't know. Only you can answer that. But I do know it's important. And finally, your executive and stakeholder team. These are the people that ultimately decide to add more team members or to expand the role or to give you a raise or to keep you employed. How are you communicating with them? If it's one way, either from you to them or them to you, that's bad. It needs to be a cycle. It needs to be a loop. You need to know what your exec team thinks of you. Not you personally, you and your team and the job you're doing. If they can say with an honest sincerity, our DevOps organization is successful because we measured these things and we see your team as critical in making that work and your metrics are amazing. That's going to be a great overall experience for everybody involved. If they're like, I don't know who you are, I don't know what you do, all I know is our customers are mad this percentage of the time and that ain't acceptable, heads will roll. Ultimately, that's how it works. They're defining success in a way that should be very closely aligned with your definition of success. If you don't know what their definition of success is, that's a problem in and of itself. Your exec team works for you as much as you work for them. I'm a firm believer in this. If your execs have an open door policy, spend a Friday afternoon going and talking to them. It is eye-opening to go ask your COO what they really care about for the next quarter. If you don't have an executive summary that you have access to, go talk to your VP of whatever or your CXOs and ask, hey, can I get 15 minutes of your time? I'm just curious about what's the vision here. If they all have the same vision and it matches what you went in that room thinking, man, that's a good sign. And that's a place that I would want to work. So you in all of this, what Git Metrics can tell you. How am I defining you? Well, I can't define you. Only you can define you. But here's my advice to you as a person. If you care about what I just talked about, if you care about fixing your DevOps organization, if you care about getting to that elite status with Dora 4, if you care about delighting your customers, then give yourself access to as much data as you're allowed. I'm not saying go break into your data lakes. I'm not saying go study business intelligence. Unless you want to do that, go do that if you want to do that. But what I am saying very, very plainly is that the more data you have on hand, the more you can understand what's going on. Don't drown in that data. Start thinking of it in terms of how does this map back to a successful DevOps, an overall business, an overall organization goal. But it starts with having the data, having access to it. If you're storing data in 5 systems of truth, do you have a way into that? Like I said earlier with Salesforce or HubSpot or one of those kind of systems, have you ever even seen a report out of there? Are you seeing the same worldview of data that all the other teams are? If not, maybe it's time to have a conversation. If you can't unblock that access, who can? Work with your team, work with your executive team members to make sure the data is free flowing. If it's not free flowing and it's got to be very tight to the chest, that's not a good sign. Security reasons aside, yes, please. If it's personal identifying information of a customer, you shouldn't be accessing that. I'm not suggesting that at all. Security wise, that's a bad idea. But overall business trends, churn rate, things like that are very important that you as a developer have a heads up about. Communication. I talked about it earlier. I mentioned it in several slides. Again, the whole goal, I think, of Dora is to help us with that communication strategy and give us a way to tell ourselves if our communication strategies are effective or not. Is everyone on the same platform and using the same tech? If not, what does it take to get us there? How can you get everyone as excited about Loom as I am? I'm not trying to sell you Loom. I do not work for Loom. If you use it, that's cool. If not, I'm playing around here. Or do you find yourself working around your project management system? That's a whole talk in and of itself. Are you subverting yourself? Are you working in real time because the PM system's too slow? That's going to cause more problems than it solves. It's better in the long run to solve the problem of communication through your PM, your project management system is a little too slow than it is to work around it, because that is chaos. And I've worked in that too many times in my career. The last one is something very akin to what an old VP of sales of mine used to say: cement, waffles, frog, helmet. Just saying something louder doesn't make it clearer. Always remember that when you're communicating with your teams. If you're frustrated, be frustrated. There's nothing wrong with being frustrated. Shouting at someone because you're frustrated is a bad way to work. It's going to make everyone angry and everyone's going to have a bad time, especially you. If they don't understand what you're saying, unless it's literally because you mumbled it under your breath when you're talking to them across the room, shouting isn't going to make it better. Just remember that. Asking yourself, like, what part of this is unclear, and defining terms out is always going to be more helpful. Screenshots, extremely helpful. Loom videos, again, not trying to sell you Loom, but Loom videos make things a little easier to understand as you're communicating these things. Lastly, if you're communicating just with your team by yourself, nothing's going to work right for you. You have to get buy-in from the top and from the bottom. If you are at the bottom, then yes, you need to get buy-in from the middle and the top. If you have a very flat structure, you need to get buy-in from as far as you can reach left and right, north and south, whatever directions you called your flat organization. If the status quo is what people want, if they're like, it runs, it ain't broke, we ain't fixing it, but you see it as something that needs fixed, that's a problem. I don't know what the answer to that is. I do know it's a big world. I do know that there are other people that will see the world more the way you see it. Maybe you'd be happier there. But if they say, hey, I hear what you're saying. You've communicated with us very clearly. You're passionate about fixing our DevOps practice. How do we do that? How can I get you that data? Then you're probably in the right place. You might not get there tomorrow, but you will get there. Eventually, you'll get to elite performance. So in conclusion, just to sum up everything I said for the last 45 minutes, metrics are super important. We have access to a lot of data as organizations, a lot. Knowing what to measure out of all that data is arguably as important as taking the measurement itself. Google did a ton of science, paid for a bunch of science, I should say, and it boiled it all down to the Dora, DevOps reporting assessment. Chasing the metrics in isolation is bad. Mapping the data, underlying the Dora 4 metrics is good next step once you have access to the data you need. It's not the whole picture, but it's a good next step. Communicating all of this to everyone and all the teams is critical to making all this work, because ultimately that's the goal of DevOps, is good communication. And as I showed in that one slide earlier, there's a bunch of tools that can help you gather this data. But I don't want to leave this talk thinking, hey, if I just get this one platform, if I just buy into this one organization's idea of how I should do DevOps, then all my problems go away. No tool can fix bad communication. No tool can fix a bad culture. The only thing that fixes that is communication, because ultimately, elite performers communicate the most effectively. They understand what they're doing very deeply. It's in the DNA of every person that works there and the org itself. And they're all bought in to the idea that DevOps is important and that it's important to make it happen in a sane, scalable, safe way that makes everyone feel part of it and successful. I could make 5 more slides like this, and I almost did in one of my original versions of this deck. But I think these top 6, if you start here, will point you in the same direction that I was down. And these are, I think, were the most helpful things I read in preparation for this. Accelerate, go read that. If you haven't read that, that is your next book you need to read and buy. Buy and read, I mean. They keep updating it. There's a 2021 update to it. Go read that as well. But if you don't have the base science and methodology in your head, it won't be as effective, I don't think. So read the book first. Linear B, thank you very much. If anyone's from Linear B is watching, they've written a lot of amazing articles and documentation on how Git analysis works. Go read their stuff. It's great. I love them. Exploring Dora Metrics. There's a great talk by someone from Brendan O'Leary from the GitLab team, who did this awesome talk at a GitCon last year, GitCon 2021, I should say, on exploring Dora Metrics that goes into detail. And really, part of this talk is taken directly from a couple of things he said. So much thanks to Brendan out there. Shout out to him. DevOps Research and Assessment Key Metrics API. The docs for how GitLab is addressing this are extremely revealing about how they're approaching this from a pure code methodology standpoint. If you're not a coder, maybe skip that one. But if you are a coder, literally, it was eye-opening for me, and I learned a lot just reading that one very small doc page. It's kind of buried in there too. But getting started with Agile DevOps Metrics, it's the handbook. It's literally the marketing handbook for how they talk about this stuff, and it's a great place to start. It's somewhat well organized, I will say that, but I would read everything else here first, and that's a really good resource to jump off of. All of these things are going to leave you with more questions than answers, I think. But they're all good questions that you should be asking. You can ask me anything you want. I'm Dwayne. I live in Chicago. I'm a developer advocate since 2016. I'm on Twitter. Happy to chat about anything out there. I love talking about rock and roll. Special thanks to Microsoft for making all this possible, along with SQL Server Geeks, Data Platform Geeks, here at the Awesome Data Platform Summit 2022. Reminder to you, if you're watching this live, there are 3 ways to win prizes. Post your selfie with a hashtag, give session conference feedback, or visit our sponsors and exhibitors. Again, I'm Dwayne. Thank you very much for the time.